I was once told that a conference presentation should have only 1 point. I have 1 point to make in this talk, but I hope I will have enough, which might get us back on time a little bit. But I will leave with a few questions, which maybe I can invite people to come back to me with their opinions on during the lunch break and such like. The question that we really got is to do with the semantics of inclusivity. This is the notion of inclusivity, I think, will be familiar to everybody in this room. It's a very pervasive distinction in the oceanic languages. In fact, I think it's universal. It was actually only noticed by Western linguists comparatively late. It was first described as a phenomenon in human languages in a 1560 grammar of Quechua. But it's fundamentally to do with the referential denotation of pronouns and to a certain extent also verbal inflection. So in these two maps from Michael Ciseaux, if somebody can correct me on the pronunciation of that last name, I would be very grateful. In these two maps from Walls, we can see on the left the languages of the world that have a distinction between inclusive and exclusive pronouns, and in the map on the right we see the overlap, the intersection of the languages that make an inclusive and exclusive distinction in pronouns, and also make an inclusive-exclusive distinction in verbal inflections. And there is an example from Ngiti, which is a Nilo-Saharan language, provided for you, showing how that operates. As we know, these kinds of distinctions are pervasive and very strong areal feature, not only of oceanic languages, but of a lot of the Australian languages. The question that Shae and I wanted to propose today, to address today, was one that was actually presented in passing really, in a presentation that Andrew Gray made last year at a conference in Port Vila to honour John Lynch. Andrew mentioned in his discussion of SCAE verbal prefixes that it was his impression that first-person inclusive subjects were associated more often with ongoing or imminent events. And this, of course, implies by contrast that first-person plural exclusive subjects are going to be associated more often with past events. And this struck me as an extraordinary claim to make. I had no idea where he might have come up with this from, as I had never seen anybody make an association between temporal relations and inclusivity before. It's generally been treated as being purely to do with referential denotation. It turns out that actually there has been some work in English of all languages that shows that predicates where the subject is inclusive as the addressee do occur less frequently with past tense reference. So there is some evidence out there in the literature that suggests that there is some kind of intersection between temporal relations and pronominal reference. Our task that Shae and I set ourselves over last summer was to try and work out whether Andrew Gray's generalisation held, and to sort of present as a larger question whether this might be a general property of inclusive and exclusive predicate marking. We did this by going back to a corpus of conversational Bislama that I recorded some time ago. It was recorded with speakers in Santo and West Marlow. And part of the reason why we're tracking the different source of the speakers is that one of the only other discussions of inclusivity in one of these Creole languages, like Bislama, was from Romaine's work, Suzanne Romaine's work on Tok Pisin, where she found that there was some regional differences in Papua New Guinea in how people used the inclusive-exclusive distinction. It is a corpus that gives us nearly 4,000 finite clauses, including, and for the purposes of this preliminary analysis, this preliminary exploration of the question, we're looking at all subjects, so noun phrases, pronominal and null subjects. And we're looking at all persons and numbers, of course, because if we want to find out whether first person inclusive or exclusive pronouns are more or less likely to occur than any other subject type with past or non-past reference, then we need to look at all of them. We can't just compare the two of them. We have to find out whether it might be the case that inclusive pronouns are occurring more often than any other pronoun, okay? We need to make sure that we're looking across the whole system. So how do we do this? We're looking at, as I say, a very large corpus. Most of the verbs that we're concerned with are actually bare verbs, which in Bislama can have past or non-past interpretation. Sometimes the temporal reference of the clause is disambiguated with the use of adverbials. And where we don't have adverbials, we rely on the translations which were checked and provided by a native speaker, Sharon Mori-Tabi, who was a native speaker of Bislama living in Santo when I was doing my PhD fieldwork there. So we've got some examples of the kind of disambiguation we get with adverbials. And we also have the by marking of clauses, which cues various Irrealis readings. At any rate, we can certainly say non-past in most cases. So we get examples like I think by mi stop lo walk, I think if I were at work, or by you mi no savi stop in mouth lo you. We can't just cover up your mouth. This was in the context of if you're overweight, you have to make a choice yourself to stop eating. We can't just block your mouth. Okay, so we're looking at a verbal system that essentially looks like this. This is what first person exclusive and inclusive, second person and third person singular, dual, trial and plural look like in Bislama. In principle, while we have a number of tokens of dual and trial in my corpus, what Shae and I have done is combine them in the end with plurals because we don't have enough tokens of duals and trials on their own to analyse them separately. But the crucial point that we're looking at here is the contrast between the exclusive forms and the inclusive forms. So notice that what Bislama has for the inclusive forms is a hybrid pronoun. So we have something like you, me, so you plus me, so the first person and the second person combined. In Sissot's cross-linguistic work on inclusivity, he actually excluded all examination of languages like Bislama, where you have these hybrid inclusive pronouns, because he argued that they could in principle pattern either with first person or with second person. You didn't know which one they would go with, and he was sort of doing an initial exploration to try and work out how inclusivity works and whether inclusives and exclusives tend to pattern with first or second person. However, we're going to dive right in there because that's what we've got to work with. It's the only data we've got. Okay, so here we go towards the one main point. What do we find? If the claim was that we can have, well, what do we see initially? What we find is that the data is roughly equally balanced for past and non-past tenses across all persons and numbers. It does appear that, in fact, first person plural inclusive subjects in Bislama occur more often with non-past tense in non-past tense contexts than they do with past tense contexts, and conversely, that first person plural exclusive subjects do occur more often with past tense than they do with non-past tense. So you see a very nice reversal. If you look at the numbers in the past tense column, you can see that the exclusive occurs 70% of the time in some kind of past tense reference, and the inclusive only occurs 13% of the time in some kind of past tense reference. Okay, so we also subjected the percentages. It's perhaps a little over the top to try and run something like this on in a statistical analysis, because you've actually got a very clear distributional difference. But one of the things that we get from doing a multiple regression analysis is we can look at various other factors that might be contributing to this, including the origin of the speaker and how often you get all the different. We can take into consideration the relative proportions of all of these different clause subject types. So what we've got here is a printout that, the results of a multiple regression analysis that shows us the probability with which you are likely to get the pronoun, which is the pronoun type shown on the left, in a past tense context. Okay, so the percentages are what you saw in the last slide, but what we've added here is the probability that says that, and this tells us that indeed it is very much more likely that first person plural exclusive will occur in a past tense context, and it's very unlikely that first person plural inclusive will occur in a past tense context. And the effect for the first person plural inclusive is very, very strong. Okay, so we see that that's actually quite low compared to the first person plural exclusive. Okay, so one of the things we could sort of ask ourselves is what's going on here? What's the actual trigger? I suppose, actually, before I move on to that, I should say, well, so basically what we've got is support for Andrew's suggestion with respect to SCAE. We do have this kind of split that he suggested, and it is the case that when you're talking about events that include the addressee, they are less likely to be past tense events. They're more likely to be ongoing or imminent events. Okay, then that's what we've got in the first person plural inclusive there at the bottom. But I think what Andrew missed, he was very smart to see this, but what he missed was actually a larger generalisation, which is that it's not a contrast between first person plural exclusive and first person plural inclusive. Certainly not in Bislama. What we think we've got here, Shae and I think we've got in effect for just the second person singular in general. So this is the advantage of having done the analysis with all of the different persons and numbers. We can not only say that yes, Andrew was right in his intuition about what was going on with the contrast between first person plural inclusive and first person plural exclusive, but we can validate, we can verify that in fact what the crucial factor here is not clusivity, but it's you. Okay, because in principle clusivity could be about someone else, but it turns out it's about you. And if you're talking about someone else, there's a very strong disfavouring effect across all of the corpus for you for having any kind of reference about past tense. Okay, so any reference to the addressee is going to be about some kind of ongoing or imminent event. Okay, does this hold across different varieties? It turns out pretty well when we separate the data into two subsets, one for the Malo speakers and one for the Santo speakers, that we get very, very similar results. So the main thing that we notice here is that we have polarization in the behaviour of first person plural exclusive and first person plural inclusive. But we also notice that there is a little bit of a difference in how second person singular is treated. And we don't know what the possible reason for this might be. It's possible that there is some kind of cross-linguistic or inter-language or inter-variety, inter-dialectal differences allowed in how people understand the inclusive-exclusive distinction because it seems to pattern a little bit differently. So the Malo speakers are more likely to allow you to refer to the other person in the past tense. Okay, so we have overall, we've got support for Andrew's claim that the first person plural inclusive is associated more often with ongoing or imminent events, and that the exclusive is associated more with past tense events. And we've suggested that we could go even further, and we could sort of say that that what's really happening here is that the crucial determinant is whether or not you're talking about the addressee. There are a number of implications of this. Some of them are typological and some of them are pragmatic. I'll just first review sort of how what we've found fits with previous work that's been done on inclusivity. Sisso's survey work notes that exclusive pronouns are often syncretic with first person singular pronouns, and he says so that what that means is that in fact first person plural exclusive pronouns are a type of first person. That shouldn't be plural, but first person, but the inclusive is not. In Danielle's work on inclusivity as well, there's a claim made that the exclusive we, the first person exclusive, is the only real first person plural in languages that have an inclusive exclusive distinction, and that inclusive pronouns are not a subcategory of first person, but a person entirely of their own. And we think that our Bislama data, our analysis, is consistent with both of these observations by Sisso and Danielle. The fact that me-filler patterns with me and you-me does not pattern with other first-person forms seems to hold with Sisso's generalisation, and the fact that you-me patterns with you but occurs with past tense at even lower rates than you, so the inclusive form patterns with you but occurs with past tense forms at even lower rates than the second person singular, seems to be consistent with Danielle's points. So what? Okay, so we tried to sort of think, Shae and I have been batting this around, and this is what I hope I'll get your feedback on, and I'm happy to, as I say, bounce it into the lunch break if we want to move on to that fairly quickly. What we think is going on here, what we want to suggest is that you've got some kind of pragmatic or politeness effect. Essentially, it's an evidentiality kind of issue. Because past tense have been and happened, they are verifiable, they are, as it were, a matter of record. And so we're going to suggest that what we're seeing here in this preference for avoiding talking about putting the second person in subject position in any kind of past tense report is that it's somewhat infelicitous, or it could be deemed infelicitous, for a speaker to claim that kind of authority or that kind of subjectivity that is required for putting you, the person you're directly addressing, into subject position. It is, if you think about it, a little bit odd to tell somebody you're directly talking to what has happened to them or what they might have experienced in the past, right? There's something a little pragmatically weird about that, okay? On the other hand, any ongoing event is not a report to the extent that you might want to talk about what's happening to you and the person you're directly addressing at this moment. It's more of a commentary, okay? And so it's subject to negotiation, as are indeed any statements about imminent or future events, because these have not happened yet, and so we would suggest anyway, that they're open for all parties to negotiate or to postulate about. So we think that there's probably some kind of pragmatic basis for the generalisation, and it's a particularly interesting one because it seems to be governing, sort of what's going on in a language like Bislama, which is really quite different in terms of, the functions that Andrew was interested in, trying to describe the difference between inclusive and exclusive and temporal marking for SCAE. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, I'll go Ross, I'll go Anna, and then there was one, Manfred, and yeah.
Okay, just quickly, yes, I think your pragmatic approach is clearly the right one. But I didn't get whether you were separating questions from assertions. It is perfectly normal to ask people, did you do this, have you done that?
Right. Yeah. That's a very good point. No, we haven't. Yes, so that would definitely be worth filtering out. And it's possible that that's what's going on with the distinction between the Malo data and the Santo data. Much more of my Malo data is just me plopping a tape recorder, as it was, down on a table with people in the community, whereas in Santo it was much more me doing sociolinguistic type interviews.
Right.
Yeah. So they would not have been asking so many of the questions. Yeah. That's possibly true. Yeah. Anna. Yeah.
And also reminiscing.
Oh, sorry. I've been muting myself. There you go. Thank you. I think this is really exciting work. I've been looking at person dialectics of different kinds as discourse markers for a while, and it keeps being the second person that kind of pops up. And I think pragmatic and politeness affects politeness in a very, very broad sense, kind of in this face-threatening sense, may play a role. It certainly plays a role as a kind of a wake-up. Oh, shit, somebody's addressing me. I better listen to this. And so I've seen that in very different contexts. So it might be interesting to talk about that. But a similar question to Ross. Have you tried to look at separating hortatives from let's do this, which would be in your ongoing events or imminent events, which is, like a imperative kind of thing, which is very different from description or also different from a commentary. So that might allow to have clearer numbers.
No, well, it actually, that's when our numbers start to break down. Yeah, that's a really good point. And initially, Shae was being very exhaustive in her coding, but we have very few hortatives. Yeah. Okay. So we can't. So we just lump them in with the bi. But you're right. I mean, because bi is very, and these Irrealis events are actually grouping together somewhat different semantic entities. We should, at some stage, consider trying to pull them out and at least have a qualitative look at them. Yeah, you're
Thanks.
right. Yeah. Manfred, then Alex. Yeah.
Well, I had actually the same questions, but one suggestion is it's well known by now that the first person inclusive is not a first person. Can we sort of come up with an idea or move to give up this as a category and have shorter glosses and do something against tradition?
Okay, well that's good. Yeah, I didn't realise that that was the way the wind was blowing, but yeah, that would certainly fit. We would be very happy with that, yeah.
Thanks, Miriam. Essentially, I was going to raise the 2 points of separating questions from statements and also hortatives, because it's true that, I mean, it's an interesting, fascinating finding that you, me, or inclusive won't pop up in the same sort of context, and it will be overwhelmingly found in hortative. Let's do this, or shall we do this, or if we can go tomorrow, so that would be indeed mostly irrealis. And it has to do with egophoricity, I think, what is now called egophoricity, and also the matter of what are shared references, what is known to the other scene, what is known to myself, but not to you.
Yeah.
And then I guess some languages will, for instance, if I'm sort of commenting on what we did last week, I might say, some languages will say, you and I went to the restaurant last week, right? So there would be a clause which would be sort of topicalized, where you would have a verb, a predicate in the past, but that would be the start of a second sentence, like, you remember that dish we had, which was wonderful?
Right.
And so other languages would use probably nominalization in this case, like the restaurant last week we went to.
Yeah, well, we don't know that, right? And that's part of the reason why we did this particular study with a corpus, okay? Because, people have made, interesting and I'm sure valid observations, such as that one, but they're entirely anecdotal, and we don't really know. So that was why we were trying to, sort of actually look at what are people doing. Because, of course, as we show, you can, and people do still refer to you, me, inclusive, with respect to past
That's what I'm saying.
It's just dispreferred.
That was my point.
And that's...
Yeah.
Well, that was my point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So good, you got it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's dispreferred. Yes, that's right. It is possible, but dispreferred. Yes. Thank you. Sure, Mike. Yeah.
Do you think then, when you do have inclusivity for past events or exclusivity for future events, is there a link between the type of information conveyed then, such as if I'm with my friends reminiscing about past events, or if I'm speaking to you and I'm talking about something, explaining what I've been doing today with my other friends, that's different. So is there anything to do with like the type of information conveyed?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that. That's a really good suggestion, yes, because if we're right, and if this general story about it being, sort of to do with pragmatics is correct, then we should find that there's some kind of conversational implicature when you go against because the trend is so remarkably strong, so we should get some kind of implicature, whether it's consistent or whether it bounces back and forth between various kinds of extra information. But yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Paul's getting in before the organisers. Yes, okay. Yeah.
Just a couple of points. One is, obviously it depends on the type of speech event that you're dealing with. And then if you have a historical narrative, you're not going to get any inclusive pronouns. That's stating the obvious. But,
right. Yeah.
So maybe mention that when you're talking about the type of corpus that you're looking at. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's why I think I did say that what we were looking at was a corpus of conversational Bislama. Yeah. So, and it is, you're right. It's crucial that it has to be something that's conversational, because otherwise you don't get a lot of these second-person singular pronouns at all. Yeah.
Secondly, if I may, you've given me a great idea for my paper, which I'm still writing. Yeah. It's one of the innovations of Proto-Polynesian is that the first-person inclusive plural pronoun has become a polite first-person singular exclusive.
Right.
Does anyone have any? Does that happen at all in any?
Yeah, there's quite a big literature on where you get your polite forms from. Yeah, your polite pronoun forms from across linguistic literature. And
but I see, but not specifically in Vanuatu.
No, not that I know of in Vanuatu. Okay. Yeah, but that's certainly an attested path. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.